Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. My name is Steve McMenamin. I'm the Executive Director of the Greenwich Roundtable, and I'd like to welcome you all to our annual symposium of the Founders Council on Contemporary Philanthropy. I'd like to thank John Griswold and the Commonfund Institute for generously underwriting tonight's symposium. Greenwich has a long tradition of community support and giving back. We'd like to think that that extends into the investment world. Last year, we heard Paul Newman acknowledge his incredible luck, as he puts it, and describe his own unorganized, as he puts it, brand of philanthropy. Tonight, we start with the wonderful observation that philanthropy is learned, passed on from one seasoned philanthropist to one who's just beginning. Great philanthropists can be mentors to those who are just learning. Tonight, we have two of the brightest lights in this universe, and I'll briefly introduce them. Bill Gates Sr. is the head of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and father of one of the wealthiest men in the world. Mr. Gates is charged with distributing the money for the largest foundation in the world, and this is not as easy as it sounds. He served in the U.S. Army in World War II, built one of the leading law firms in Seattle. Mr. Gates is a tireless advocate of education, the community of Seattle, and easing the suffering of children. Christopher Hohn is the founder of the Children's Investment Fund, a successful, event-driven hedge fund based in London. The Children's Fund is unique not only in its investing discipline, but also because it hands up over 1% of its assets to alleviate poverty in children. Chris has rapidly emerged as one of England's most generous philanthropists. The moderator of tonight's Founders Council is Vern Sedlacek, the CEO of Commonfund. Commonfund's a unique nonprofit organization that serves mission-based investors. Vern is an old friend of the Roundtable. Before the Commonfund, Vern was president of John Henry & Company and the chief financial officer for the fabled Harvard Management Company. Vern?
Thanks, Steve. There are two bright lights on the panel tonight. And we underwrote this, Steve. I'm not one of them. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking a little bit about the history of philanthropy. Philanthropy has been an enormously important part of the American economy. And interestingly enough, it is a growing part of the American economy. When we look at the growth of philanthropy, the giving to charities and to other mission-based organizations, we've seen it's grown dramatically over the last 10 years. And in fact, it's a large philanthropy, charity, and the industry of nonprofits is a larger part of the economy today than it was 10 years ago by a substantial margin. It really all started back in the 1850s with a couple of gentlemen who really began to contribute their wealth to focused approaches to helping out society. The first was a gentleman named George Peabody, who basically grew up in the East Coast, did a lot of work in London in banking and in Baltimore in banking, and gave his wealth really for establishment of a couple of different things. There are two Peabody museums, one at Harvard and one at Yale, both founded by his donations. In addition, there's today there are 40,000 Londoners who have their homes paid for by the money that he gave in 1859. The second major contributor that began the whole kind of concept of wealth, giving their wealth away, was a gentleman named Peter Cooper, who really grew up very poor, made a lot of money in industry, and in 1859 created the Cooper Union, Cooper Union College, which is operating today. It's still one of the only tuition-free institutions that exist. So the foundation that he did almost 200 years ago is something that's still created today. Certainly, we've all heard about the Rockefellers, we've heard about the Fords, the Carnegies, etc. But philanthropy is really continuing today. There's an interesting college which was just founded about 5 years ago called the Franklin W. Olin College of Engineering, which was created, as I said, 5 years ago, with a grant, basically a foundation from the Olin Foundation, to create another tuition-free institution outside of Boston for engineering. So we've seen the change in charity, we've seen the growth in charitable contributions, we've seen the growth in foundations, and clearly it is a very important thing as people look at what to do with their wealth and give back to society. It is a growing and important part of this overall society and industry. And I think one of the interesting things you'll hear about tonight is the fact that a lot of what we talked about earlier, what I talked about earlier was about giving in the U.S. And I think one of the things that Chris and Mr. Gates are going to talk about is really looking at overseas and helping developing countries, which I think is a really new and interesting approach. There's many different approaches to charity. I just want to end with one quick story. The fundraisers from Harvard went into J.P. Morgan's office timidly to ask him for money because they were putting together some new buildings for the medical school, and of course they were very nervous going into J.P. Morgan's office, and they said we'd like a donation, and he said, well, do you have any plans, blueprints for these buildings? And they took them out and they laid them out, and he flips through and he says, I'll take that one, and that one. Good day, gentlemen. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris and let him talk about his very creative approach to giving and really helping society as a whole. Chris?
Thank you for inviting me this evening. I'll give a little background on how I entered a bit into this field and what our foundation is doing. 20 years ago, I had a summer job in the Philippines and visited a place called Smoky Mountain, which is a garbage heap where there were several thousand families living there, and saw something I couldn't really believe I saw, which were children, young children collecting garbage to live. And I thought at that point, if I could at some point in my life do something to address this absolute poverty in which a large proportion of the world live today, I would do so. And 10 years ago, I started working for a U.S. hedge fund in New York, and was lucky enough to make enough money that I didn't need to work anymore, and thought about retirement, but decided instead to start a fund in 2004 and name it the Children's Investment Fund. And we committed to give contractually 0.5% to 1% of assets, depending on performance, but always 0.5%, to a charitable foundation for children in poverty in developing countries. And in addition to that, I give 99% of my profit share to the foundation. People asked us, investors asked us when we started the fund, because many didn't like the idea, didn't like the name, didn't like the fee structure, even though it was the same fees that we would charge anyway, and they and the reason we called it that name was to inspire other wealthy people and hedge fund managers like you here today to think more about philanthropy. And we told investors we wanted to die happy rather than rich. And not sure it was that convincing to people. And we had Harvard University throw our presentation in the dustbin and say they would never take our call because of the mixture of combining a hedge fund with a charity was not appealing to them. Anyway, we started off, and we were lucky enough to we've been in business coming up to 3 years now, and we've made our investors $6 billion of profits and compounded at 40% net of fees over the last 3 years on average. And so the foundation's become large enough to do some meaningful things. We're focused on children in poverty in developing countries, and initially 4 countries in Africa plus India. Why developing countries? To us, it was obvious that the returns on investment of philanthropy there were orders of magnitude higher than in developed countries, and you could save a life for anywhere between $1 and $100. We felt the returns that were available, and as investors, we look for the highest returns on capital, were super compelling, and the magnitude, the amount of money going in there was very immaterial relative to the problem. And to give one, a lot of our work so far has been focused on HIV/AIDS, where there, if you look at slide 6 in the presentation, I'm not going to go through all the slides, but just highlight a couple. Today, there are 40 million people in the world with HIV or AIDS. Last year, or this year, 3 million people died from the disease, and there are some 12 million orphans created from HIV/AIDS out of a total orphan population in sub-Saharan Africa of 50 million orphans, defined as having lost one parent or both parents. And this is a mind-boggling numbers. And the photograph you see there is one I actually took 3 years ago in Kenya. It's a grandmother who's actually bringing up 6 grandchildren in a place called Homa Bay on the shore of Lake Victoria, and she has no income, and her children are all dead from HIV/AIDS, and it's an impossible situation. And all around there, I saw mud huts with children as young as 5 and 6 living alone with a shallow grave with their parents buried outside. And, things that, unless you see it with your own eyes, you won't believe it. And the numbers are, as you can see from the graph, are just escalating because there's no antiretroviral drugs can halt the disease, and but they're not at this moment fully distributed, and there are lots of issues with getting them there. But we felt that these drugs were very powerful, and we for not much above $100 a person a year, you could save a life of a mother and stop her orphaning a child. And to us, that was a very compelling investment. And we also realized, as an example, that children were not getting any of the drugs. There was nobody outside of Brazil and Thailand making them. And what does it mean for a child who's got HIV/AIDS? Slide 7 shows some questions that were put to children who have the disease, and orphans, some of whom will have the disease, and if you look at this, do you wish you were dead? Lots of people saying yes. and in pain. It's not a you live a life in pain and depression. So slide 8 is a project that we initiated to try to bring drugs to 12,000 children with the disease, and we approached the Clinton Foundation to contract with them, and they did a deal with Cipla, a generics company in India, which bought the drugs for 12,000 children, and now they're scaling it with the help of some government money and to 200,000 children initially out of 400,000 who in total could need it. And so it's an exciting project, because initially we put in $1 million and raised another $3 million from other hedge fund people and foundations, and a small amount of money. This was just not being done for children. They saw it as a dead-end disease, and just focused on the adult population. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. The whole area of preventing pregnant mothers giving birth to positive children is a huge untapped area that is criminal, that is not being addressed, and so there are solutions, and both in the prevention and the care side, which due to shortage of money just aren't happening. And I think that a few points I'd make about the approach that we take. We're very hard-nosed in how we try to look at tackling problems. It's a very engaged approach. We've been very much activists as investors in the public equity markets, and in the foundation world, we're also very engaged and to rather like private equity, to sit on boards and be rigorous, evaluate, and demand results. We have very clear value for money and a results-oriented philosophy. So page 10 gives you some sort of example of this, of a program we're doing with currently 9,000 AIDS orphans in Kenya, where we give it's a home visit program where we put orphans in preschool, get mosquito net, emergency food if they need it, and medical services as needed, and the results of before and after the interventions are quite dramatic, and so there, we are trying to scale this now to about 130,000 children, and it'll be a significant managerial challenge that we're very focused on doing, and we believe you can have good results in these countries. And I know from talking to some of you here tonight, you are skeptical that you can invest with results in developing countries, and that the money will go down the toilet. And historically there has been a history of failure of investing in these countries, and our view is that there's a difference today, and that it's private sector money that's entering in, not government and NGO money solely, and that the private sector money wants results, and if they don't get them, they're not going to fund. And we feel like that it's our money, and we want results for it, and we believe in that you can get that. You have to be very engaged and very rigorous and hard-nosed in planning and executing. And but we think that there are also opportunities for very substantial leverage. We have another example, slide 9 is a program we've done in India. We started to work in India a couple of years ago because at that point the infection rate in India was 1 to 2% and of HIV/AIDS, and in many African countries it's 10 to 20%. So if India went to 20% of 1 billion people, it would be a catastrophe. And we did a program. We partnered with a state government there, where we bought the drugs, and they did everything else to distribute them. It went from started with 1,000 people, and then thousands more came knocking on the doors and saying, "We need the drugs. We're dying too." And they expanded the program to 4,000, and now the government is likes the program and is taking on the funding of the drugs there, and has asked us to go into another state. And we've also funded the Clinton Foundation for technical assistance to the government for training doctors and nurses nationally, and procurement, setting up a lab network. And what I'm trying to illustrate is there are projects which are intelligent and have leverage and scale and effectiveness that are out there, which you could all be involved in. And I think that for not a lot of money, Carter Center is trying to raise money for $15 million to eradicate malaria in Ethiopia. Very powerful project. And the amount of money involved for some of these interventions is unbelievably low. For a $6 mosquito net, you can save a child's life, or $1 for a malaria drug. It's to our minds, it's immoral that more is not being done, and for poverty alleviation. All of us are members of the Lucky Sperm Club. Myself included. We were lucky enough to be in a certain time, a certain place where we were able to have a privileged existence. And my question is, why are allies worth anything more than the people in another country who are dying for to have a dollar medicine or something for clean water or healthcare or an education. And it's not to say that what we do is the only thing. There's other great causes like the environment that need addressing. It's just one of multiple areas. And we have been, I think, inspired by the work we've done, but we feel that we will certainly not have succeeded if there is, all of you don't also get more involved in philanthropy. So I'll stop there.
Chris, can I just ask a couple questions? You said you did a year of research.
Yes.
Could you tell me a little bit about how that went, what you did, how did you get started? Because it's
we started networking with people in the area of developing countries, and so we went to see some of the obvious names like UNICEF, and just cold called, and we were fortunate enough to get one of our trustees, who's head of HIV/AIDS globally for UNICEF, to serve when we were really nothing, and he helped us a lot in educating us about the nature of the problem, and we've subsequently taken on other trustees, ex-head of Clinton's work in India. So we've tried to build a serious board of trustees who are experts. And we started to learn at that point that there were no there were few model programs, and that there was a lot of entrepreneurship needed, actually, and there was very nobody was going to tell you everything to do. And one of the things that's important for people like you to be involved is you're all very bright and successful, and this is a world that needs more than just money. It needs people to be engaged funders who can add their analytical skills and managerial skills to making sure that the money is well spent. But there's plenty of people who will help you if there's an area, and other foundations are always, we found, happy to help. We share all our research with any other interested funder or foundations. We co-invest with other people. If we've got a great project that we don't want to fund 100%, we'll show it around to people who have expressed an interest. So I think there's it's networking. There's a lot of information out there, and you have to go and visit these places. It's they're a plane ride away.
You obviously have done a lot in a very short period of time. You can't do this all by yourself. Maybe you can. I couldn't, but of course I'm not a bright light. But the sorry, Steve. But talk a little bit about staffing. How you think about structuring an organization that has a lot of dollars under management, which obviously, but also has a much more almost a more challenging side in terms of giving the money away in a rational and effective way.
I would say we're really 2 years of seriously into the project, and we are building up actively our staff. You need to have staff, and who are we're. Sorry. We're 2 years into seriously staffing up, and what we're trying to do is have a mixture of business people and some people from the NGO development world, and we've just recently made 2 senior level hires, and one 20 years, we can't name him, is for another week, but as a COO who's 20 years very, very senior level development funding, spending $100 million a year in that area. And the second from McKinsey, Harvard Business School, non-profit world, and very much a business approach. And we've hired a Ugandan woman who works for us in Africa, who set up the largest AIDS organization in Uganda, and she leads a lot of our project level work there, plus another business person who we've sent into the field as a program director. Structurally, we're hiring one set of people to originate projects, and another set who are going to focus on ensuring that the projects organizations are well run and that the projects are executed. And it's not enough just to fund and then go away. You need to be extremely engaged to make sure the money is well spent. That's, I think, a very clear lesson for us, that you must be an engaged funder if you're but we're I think we're going to end up having at least a staff of right now it's 6 or 7 going to at least 10, and we've got these senior people. They're going to be hiring staff below them, but it's a mixture. We're going to headquarter it in the senior people in London. They'll be traveling half their time into the field, and we also have people in the field. So it's we went and interviewed a large number of foundations and asked them what the best structure was, and that was what we concluded.
Thanks, Chris. Mr. Gates, would you mind giving us your words of wisdom on the Gates Foundation?
Not at all. Thank you. I saw the full house, and it occurred to me that this was one of the few nights of the week where there's not a football game on, so I'm not taking any special pleasure in the fact that so many of you showed up, but I think it's very nice that you did, and I won't think of myself as being any part of a cause of that. I do appreciate being invited to come here to talk with you tonight. I received a list of the people who, the very distinguished people who have been on this dais on prior occasions, and I'm very pleased to join that list. I have to recognize, as of course you do, that my presence is in major part attributable to the fact that I have a last name that I share with a very truly prominent citizen, which is a fact that leads to a lot of amusing occurrences. On a typical day on the telephone, you're talking to someone at an office somewhere, and the lady on the other end who has answered the phone says, "And your name, please?" And I say, "My name is Bill Gates." And frequently the response comes something like, "Oh, yes, and I'm Minnie Mouse." Had a very interesting event happen on an airplane going out of Los Angeles one evening. I was seated in my seat, and for some reason the stewardess said my name, and she seated me and welcomed me onto the plane. And when we got up and the seatbelt light went out, a guy from a couple of rows back came back and squatted down in the aisle next to me, and he said, "So your name is Bill Gates?" And I said, "Yeah, it happens to be." And he said, "Well, that's really interesting," he says, "because my name is Bill Gates too." And he looked at me and he said, "Isn't it terrible what that young guy up in Seattle has done to us?" Anyway, so I'm going to take a largely historical approach here in talking about the Gates Foundation. It all started one evening in 1994. I was standing in line at a theater to go to a movie with my son and his wife, and we got to talking about the fact that it was really complicated for them to respond in the way they'd like to the number of inquiries and requests that they got for charitable things of one kind or another, and that they felt like they were really being seen as uninterested in those things, because a lot of times they just didn't get around to answering. So I said, "Well, look, I'm by myself now, and I'm sort of out of it at the law firm. Why don't I just do that stuff for you?" And they thought, "That's a great idea, Dad. Why don't you do that? We'll send you the letters, and we'll get together once every couple of months and talk about what we're going to do about some of these things, and that'll be just great." So that seemed like a very good thing to me and a good thing for them. And all of a sudden, about a week later, I heard from Bill, and he said, "Dad, I'm going to start a foundation." I thought, this is really an unusual thing. Here's a guy who's been advised about the fact he should have a foundation for 10 years now by his lawyers and his accountants all over him, and his sister, who is his accountant, and she's the worst of all. But he had resisted that because his feeling was that he just didn't want another entity. And I have no doubt that some of you can relate to that. Having an entity is not all cheap. It's expensive in terms of time and distraction. But he said, "Gosh, if you're going to do this stuff, why, I'm going to start a foundation." So sure enough, he started this foundation. And actually, somewhat to my surprise, he put something just short of $100 million into the thing, which made us a pretty good-sized player in the Northwest scene. So then, it was just kind of the garden variety situation. Proposals come in over the transom, and you look at them and decide what you're going to do. And we weren't very far into this, and we got into a discussion. We said, look, maybe we ought to give a little direction to this activity and get involved in something that you want to get involved in. And said, great, let's do that. Let's see if we can do something in terms of reproductive health and family planning, which was an interest that Bill and Melinda had. So we got into that. I did some looking around. It was an area in which I had some prior activity with Planned Parenthood and on the board of that organization. And So I knew a lot of people, and so we went around and talked to them, and we came up with a couple of grants which we would make, and we were feeling pretty good about this. And that got the two of them to thinking about this business of being forward about what they ought to be doing. And pretty soon I get this email from them with a reference to an article in the New York Times which described the disparity in health delivery circumstances between our country and the poor world. And Christopher has just spoken so dramatically and so effectively about that. And it touched Bill and Melinda, and so they sent this thing to me, and they said, "Dad, do you think there's anything we could do about this?" And I thought to myself, I didn't know anything about this. They didn't know anything about it, but the disparity is egregious. It is totally unacceptable, as Chris says. So I started to talk to some people and do some things, and we got into a few activities and looked into it. And of course, we were naive as we could be, but we were starting to do it, and we hired a person who knew a lot about this, who was very helpful, and then another person or two. And along the line, to my astonishment, 4 or 5 years into this project, they decided that they were going to put this huge sum of money into the foundation. They were pleased by what they were seeing happening, and they were stimulated by the sense that maybe some improvement was being made in dealing with this disparity. So they decided to put $24 billion into the thing. And not a decision readily made in the small towns of this country. But anyway, that's what they decided. It was stunning to me, stunning to all of us. But it was obviously sea change kind of a situation. And the thing that was becoming articulated was this fundamental principle which has guided us pretty centrally since that time, which is that all lives, wherever lived, have equal value. Doesn't make any difference if you live across the street or if you live in Uganda. You're a human being, and there's value in your life. And this led us to a way of thinking about things, which simply was, what problems are causing the most harm to the most people? And there wasn't any real question about what was on the top of that list. It was the health deliveries in poor countries. And so we got started down that road in a big way, as I say, and that was largely a function of engaging people who were knowledgeable and who had experience in this area. And as a part of these deliberations about what problems are causing the most harm to the most people, we decided on another, which may not surprise you too much, which was the American system of public education. 1983, you may recall, the famous commission study which came out with a book called A Nation at Risk, 25 years ago, and precious little has happened about that since. So we decided maybe that would be a good number 2 emphasis for us. One of the things that I think largely Bill brought to this, well, there isn't anything I'm going to say that wasn't largely brought to it by Bill, but anyway, he has this sense that notwithstanding the size of the foundation, I think it may have been the biggest foundation in the world at that point, that it's still small, and that the things, to be effective, you have to find ways to prevent problems. And so we've lived by that slogan since those days. The idea is to go upstream, to achieve prevention rather than treatment, and put more resources, for example, into searching for an AIDS vaccine than in funding ARV treatments. Now, I have to footnote that. As a matter of fact, as we went along, it became so obvious, and Chris has already commented on this, that the ARV treatments are so effective that all you're talking about, you're not really talking about the difference between prevention and treatment in the usual sense. You're talking about prevention on the one hand and treatment, which extends people's lives 20 and 25 years in a normal manner. So, you know, that gets around to being awful close to prevention, and it's significant. So we've dipped our toe in, not to the extent I'm sure Chris would like to see us do, given his example, but we're doing the ARV drugs things, particularly in a place called Botswana. So there we were about the time these things were happening and these deliberations were underway. We were developing some maturity about being philanthropists, and one of the things, and I say this because part of what we're talking about here, I hope, is that I'm not just telling you about the Gates Foundation, but I'm telling you about a phenomenon which could be a part of your lives. Undoubtedly, there are some of you here to whom it's already a large part of your lives. I make no mistake about that. But there may be some of you who would think that it made sense to join this party. And I will say that a thing that we learned quite early was that you have to not only decide what you're going to do, but be clear about the negative implication that you aren't going to do other things. And, you know, if you get to thinking about the things you might be interested in doing just because of some personal predilection or something in your history that makes a particular problem seem more serious to you than others, you have to appreciate that you need to be deciding this to the exclusion of other things. And I'm not talking about normal annual philanthropy that a family does. I'm talking about significant, regular, ongoing philanthropy where you're open to being approached by others, by actors, to finance what they're doing. So it's very important to be clear about what you don't do. And for example, you know, it's kind of astounding to us that we don't do anything about culture, and we don't do anything about the environment. You know, we have some very good friends who are astonished, even a little pissed, when they come around for some money from the Gates Foundation to deal with some environmental thing, and our gate's not open for that one. Anyway, the first days and years of a regular philanthropic activity can be totally chaotic if you don't understand what it is you're going to do, and by implication, be clear about what you're not going to do. The other thing it's clear to us, we're very comfortable about taking big risks. Big risks. We don't have any shareholders. We don't have any taxpayers to answer to. Just ourselves. And it's a segment of performance where it's perfect for a private foundation to be involved in. That because corporations, as you all know, can't afford to do that kind of thing, and to a large extent, governments can't really either. It's a place for private philanthropy, and we have to be prepared for the proposition that these problems are things that we're into for the long haul. And you talk about the question of whether there's ever going to be a vaccine for AIDS. You're talking about we think of that as much as 20 years from now before there is such a thing, or it's concluded that it's impossible to do, which seems unlikely. The inventiveness of American science is really stunning. We're going to solve these things. We're going to find a way to do these things. Okay, and the other thing that we've learned, and we weren't at all conscious of this when we got started, is that our resources are really, for all their size, are just a drop in the bucket. And even if you add in Warren Buffett, which is not a bad measurement for adding on, I mean, he doubled the size of what we're doing. But we're still account for something under 1% of all American charitable giving. So, you know, we don't own this place. Who owns it? The government owns it. That's what governments basically are for, dealing with major human problems. And I don't care whether you're right, left, or in the center. Governments are for dealing with societal problems, things that people can't deal with themselves, for which they have no personal responsibility. And part of what we're astonished by and pleased by is that our voice has contributed, I think, gigantically to the sense of interest in these things. I think that the global health problem has come on the screen in the last 4 or 5 years, and part of that is because of us. I didn't come here to brag to you about what we're doing, but I think that's a realistic statement. And in whatever theater, whatever venue you want to talk about, a philanthropist has the opportunity to show leadership and to bring other philanthropists and to bring public money along. And we think of that as something that is awfully important. Just a footnote here. You know, we've been really quite good about, in the United States budget in improving our commitment to this particular area. George Bush has made commitments to very major additions to the Global Fund and things of that kind, and he's very conscientious and sensitive to the fact we need to be more involved in this overseas stuff. Now, the thing that, and we praise that, but the fact remains that we're still somewhere in the neighborhood of 21st in the world. The rest of the world has taken on an obligation to spend 0.7% of its gross national product of its federal budget in the global health and assistance area. And we're just scraping above 0.001. I mean, we have a long, long way to go. And the curious thing about this, you go around and take a poll and talk to people and ask them, oh, how about that foreign aid stuff? Oh, no, that stuff is no good. You know, how much do you think we're spending on it? Oh, surely 10 or 20% of our money. Well, you know, it's just appallingly ignorant. But anyway, it's something that we feel good about encouraging. We're going to continue to do that, and I hope that some of you might agree with this. So, one thing I would like to disabuse you of is this notion that there's something new on the philanthropic scene and that we may be part of that, which is this. Some people refer to it as entrepreneurial philanthropy, and the program for tonight calls it contemporary philanthropy. I think the implications are that there's some change that's happened in American philanthropy, and that there are these spectacular performers that are showing the way for other people. Well, I think if you could find John Rockefeller and get him up out of his grave and say, John, how come you weren't more entrepreneurial? He'd be appalled. He was as entrepreneurial as anybody could be about his charity. And there's nothing special about what we're doing, or anybody else for that matter. I mean, the notion of trying to identify a cause and identify a way to deal with it is not new. It's happened for decades in this country, and it's happened in philanthropy, and it's going to go on happening. So we're a little embarrassed at being identified as the new entrepreneurs in philanthropy. So I got pretty far through these notes. Good. I will say that going down a level into the philanthropic activity, we were naive, and that's not. I don't think that's to be criticized, but in fact we were naive. It was very easy to say, okay, global health is a problem. There are these well-known tools called vaccines which deal with that. Let's do something about vaccines. And you know, that's the kind of thing you can sit in your parlor with a nice drink in front of you and talk about and say, that's what we're going to do. But that is only the beginning. You've got problems and obstacles and challenges to get from here to there that people sitting in a living room enjoying a scotch haven't the slightest idea about. But we've been at it a while now. I don't mean to say that we're some kind of prophets or disciples or any kind of an example about this thing, but we have learned something. And I'd like to just, for fun, tell you about something that happened. Well, I'll call it a case study. This is very recent. And this sort of shows the huge challenges that you run into after you say something smart like, let's do vaccines. How do we get there? How do we deliver? Now you start to see some challenges. We need more trained personnel and clinic infrastructure to deliver the vaccines effectively. That's what the guy in Ethiopia tells you. The pharma. We have to persuade pharma to make the investments in vaccine production facilities to allow for huge increases in the vaccine supplies for the developing world. Capital investment in manufacturing vaccines that those who are going to get them cannot afford to pay for. We have to fund donor countries to build infrastructure like roads, which are indispensable to get vaccines delivered. Oh, well, just for fun, these questions got answered by an old Wall Street funding mechanism that got put in place recently called the International Finance Facility for Immunizations, IFFI. Some of you may know about it. This is a financing mechanism for global immunizations. 6 European countries have promised to contribute $4 billion over the next 10 years. And the fund can sell bonds against those commitments to provide the working capital, to build plants, train people, create infrastructure to get things going. This includes using the funds for negotiating long-term contracts with the vaccine manufacturers. So, here's an ancient mechanism applied in a philanthropic setting, which is actually making possible very large, effective vaccine delivery programs, which surely will save not just thousands of lives, but will surely save millions of lives. Think about it. So, let me just say that you don't need to have resources like the Gates Foundation to do great philanthropy. There are all kinds of good things to do. And, you know, a capital campaign for the local art museum or a chair at your university, funding basic treatment by providing shelters for abused families, buying bed nets to protect kids from malaria. And then, of course, the sophisticated stuff of trying to seek out and eliminate causes of problems. We've got a bunch of people at the University of Washington. No, it's not at the university. It's another lab in Seattle. We're trying to figure out how to make the malaria-infected mosquitoes unable to smell humans. How's that for esoteric shot at a problem? They think they can do it. That's pretty exciting stuff. So, anything you can do is important and it's rewarding. And you know, you don't have to spend huge sums of money. I happen to be a fan of the fact that everybody, regardless, should do something about helping the local United Way every year. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, what an ideal thing to start off with before, if you're going to do any philanthropy at all, to write a check to your payroll deduction or whatever. Payroll deduction. I don't know about payroll deductions in this crowd. I think I'll stick with writing a check. So, and you know, there are all kinds of things going on. There's an organization called Nothing But Nets, to which basketball players make contributions for people who are working on malaria nets for malaria in Africa. You can do funding for a thing called water wells in Africa, well drilling that could provide clean water to villages. You can fund a scholarship at your college. There's so much that you can do. These things are all important. No one should feel they shouldn't do philanthropy if they can't fund a vaccine trial. Funding a $3 bed net has a positive result, just the same as funding a vaccine for malaria. So, Finally, let me just tell you about my own sense of this thing I've become involved in at my late age. I just want to tell you that it feels good. One of the best parts of philanthropy is experiencing the results of your giving. We learned this week that in the high schools we've been supporting in New York City, the new high schools, that the graduation rates there, which used to be around 30%, have risen in the past 4 years to between 70 and 80%. You know, I listen to that statistic. I see the stage in the high school, and I see those kids walking across and getting their diploma. Wow! Twice as many, more than twice as many are doing it. Another even more focused story. This is about a woman who's one of our scholarship recipients. We have a program called the Gates Millennium Scholarship that gives scholarships to low-income, smart minority kids. These are kids who could get into some of the best universities in the country, but without the funds to do so. So we have this substantial program which includes a young woman named Heidi Dominguez, who is from Warden, Washington. This is a very rural town in the central of our state, about 2,500 people, with a high school enrollment of 260 kids. She applied for and received a Gates Millennium Scholarship. So Heidi decided in her earlier life to get married after her 10th grade year. Her husband had just graduated, and she had a baby 13 months later. So she did pregnancy for her junior year and motherhood for her senior year. She didn't lose her focus, though. She still had her eye on her future, and she applied for and received this scholarship. And now she's using it at the University of Idaho. And that's not the end of the story. Her husband was so inspired by what happened to Heidi. He was working in a cattle feed company in Warden with no hope of ever going anywhere. And he decided, all right, I'm going to go to college. And he recently was able to quit his job. He got a scholarship. And now he's at Idaho, too, with his wife, Heidi, and this 2-year-old baby. And they're being supported by these scholarships. They're bright kids. And I can't help but find myself wondering where this young family would be if they were just stuck in Warden. So we put up a few bucks, and those 2 kids are going to have a totally new life. And that baby of theirs, wow, tell me about it. We can only imagine the kind of life that child will now have with those 2 university grads for her parents. Now tell me, is that too small an event to talk about? Is it okay for us at the Gates Foundation to exult with one another about these stories, which we do? Many of you could tell us similar stories, I'm sure, in your own experiences. So I just want to close by just selfishly confessing that philanthropy does have some great personal rewards. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Why don't we open it up to the audience for questions? I think there's a microphone somewhere. Is that correct? Over here. So if you don't mind coming up and they're open to any questions.
Hi. Thank you for your time today. Both of you mentioned healthcare as being an issue in emerging countries in Africa and India. I was wondering what your experience has been with healthcare companies and their willingness to help out in providing these types of drugs at a cheaper rate, perhaps, and just your experience with that. Thank you.
Chris, you want to go first?
We have experience in the pediatric AIDS drug area where it was a commercial negotiation with Indian generics company, and we're able to get through a volume discount, very low prices. The second stage is going to be, its first project for 12,000 children was like over $200 per child, and now it's going to be down to $30 to $50 per child when it's scaled. So I think we've seen that and through the Clinton Foundation, who started off doing this global purchasing deal, they've driven the prices down from $20,000 down to $100 to $150 for the adults. So it's commercial practices, but if you do volume discounts, which is why you can keep driving the prices down. I mentioned one other point that we were just discussing earlier, that there's a big issue out there today in the antiretroviral drugs of the U.S. government funding only the branded antiretroviral drugs, which are multiples of the cost of the generics, and that means that many more people die because the pharmaceutical companies are able to fund political lobbying, and that's wrong. And so we also fund advocacy against that, and so those are a couple of experiences we've had.
Bill, do you have a comment on that?
I have very little to add to that. I join Chris in saying that the response we've had has been good. I mean, that is, the law does permit a private foundation to give money to a commercial company if it's got some philanthropic end, and we can give money to Merck or Pfizer to generate some activity of theirs that would create a substance that could be used in a poor country, as a result of which their pricing is going to be different than it would have been without our contribution to the upfront cost. So we found them basically quite receptive to this. I don't know that talking about the pharmas covers everything in the question, but at least in that respect, where we've had a lot of experience, we'd give a good grade.
Other questions from the audience?
I have a question for Bill. There was a very provocative article in the New York Times Magazine this last Sunday about education. I don't know whether you happen to see that, but the thesis of the article addressed the issue on the education front, which you mentioned is one of your major thrusts. The thesis that it takes a lot more than schooling to help some of these underprivileged kids, that the underprivileged kids have, or the kids from middle-class parents do a lot of their learning at home through the culture of their home, and that having just an equal opportunity on the school front is not enough to compensate for the deficit that they face in their education, the cultural education that they get at home. And so the article questioned whether it was realistic to hope that the goals of the No Child Left Behind were achievable, given this challenge of addressing the underprivileged needs on the home front. And so I was curious if you had a view on how the United States might address that in trying to help these underprivileged children.
Yep. I have a slightly long answer to that. It's a wonderful question. We don't for a minute think that there aren't fundamental problems with the way our system of public education is developed. I'm not saying that we would campaign against the continued existence of school boards, but there isn't any doubt that the existence of school boards makes it harder to make dramatic change. We have had such better results in places like New York City, where you just go talk to Joel Klein, and you can get things done. But aside from that, I don't think there's any doubt that there is a very fundamental problem that the kids you're speaking of and the kids we've been talking about don't get started right. And slowly but surely in this country there is developing a really, really significant effort to create valuable, insightful early learning efforts. And it's spread around a lot. I remember in our state we were putting together this initiative to develop a new tax for some educational funding, and we had this negotiation between the educational people as to what part they were going to have of it, and if it ever passed, which turned out to be a terrible waste of time because it didn't pass. It involved adding a penny to the sales tax, and God, nobody wants to do that. So there were these early learning people at the table negotiating for a piece of this money, and I thought to myself, who are they? And there was I'm only talking about 2.5 years ago. But come to find out, this is a significant movement going on in this country, and I think it is the fundamental response to what you say that, if you just think about 3 kids going to kindergarten, they get to be 5 years old. 2 of them have grown up in a middle class or better home. They've got some vocabulary. They know a little. They know how to tell time. They know a little something about numbers. And kid number 3 comes from an apartment where he's been raised by a single mother who makes $15,000 a year, and her vocabulary consists of 2,000 words. And so that first afternoon, those first 2 kids get home from school, and mom says, "How did you do?" "Oh, that was fun. That was great. We liked the teacher." And so kid number 3 comes home, and his mother says, "How did you like kindergarten?" And he says, "Mom, I hate school." And there you are. You've created a loser from the word go. So we just have to start doing it. And in other countries, Italy, France, England, they've been attentive to this for a long time. So we're going to take a lot of interest. I hope you would follow with some interest the development of early learning efforts. Ain't going to be cheap.
Well, could you please join me in giving our panelists a great round of applause?
Vern, tonight's very gratifying, not only because of these 2 wonderful angels, but also because of a bright light. The Common Fund was founded in 1971 with a grant from the Ford Foundation to educate investors in colleges and universities. The Commonfund Institute has been our mentor, people like David Stores and John Griswold, Vern Sidlacek. Tonight I want to thank, you've been our mentor and our role model for over 11 years, but tonight I want to thank Carolyn Gillespie for her inspiration and for all her work in pulling all of this together. Carolyn, thank you. And as you may or may not know, John Griswold is one of our trustees. He is chair of our compensation committee. So John, would you like to say a couple words?
Thanks, Steve. I just want to say thank you for coming, because this is an opportunity to get information on one of the extraordinary events, I think, in our lifetimes, which is the enormous transfer of wealth from a public company, a for-profit company, to a philanthropy that is extraordinary, despite Mr. Bill Gates' statement that they're just regular folks. I think all of us see this as a potential sea change in the ability to inspire others to give. And of course, in philanthropy, if we can help one life, if we can help eradicate one disease or help one child get through the education system in a more productive way, we're all doing a great job. So I want to thank Bill and Chris for coming the long way they did from opposite sides of the world. And I want to say on behalf of Commonfund Institute, and I want to thank Steve too, because they have done a terrific job in educating all of us. So thank you again for coming on behalf of Common Fund. Thanks.